you literally debated Alan Dershowitz. I remember once watching you debate Alan Dershowitz on Democracy Now! When it was still just radio. And you said directly to Alan Dershowitz that he had plagiarized text from his book, The Case for Israel. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that and what happened because you did that?
Well, Alan, at that point in time, we're talking about 2003, I was already very deeply invested in the Israel-Palestine conflict in the sense of most of my political activity and scholarly investment was in that conflict. And I knew the literature like the back of my hand at that point. My good friend at the time, Noam Chomsky, recommended that I read the Dershowitz book. I said, well, Dershowitz scholarship, no. But he said, no, it's having a big impact. You should read it. And I did sit down and read it. I have to say it was amusing because in the early chapters, it was just plain that he has plagiarized Joan Peters from Time Immemorial. So that was like a double whammy. First of all, he was plagiarizing, and second of all, he was plagiarizing a hoax. A book that had already been exposed as a hoax, by the way, by me. So I contacted Amy Goodman, who I knew through a mutual friend, and I appeared on the show. She invited Professor Dershowitz and myself, and I confronted him with two kinds of challenges. Number one, that significant portions of the book were plagiarized, and number two, that every substantive fact in the book was false, flat out false, not gray areas, flat out false. These were threadbare, flagrant, blatant lies that he had assembled in this so-called book. So that was my initial allegations, two of them, plagiarism and falsification. And then in the course of the debate, which lasted a very long time, there was one half on air and one half off air, and eventually the whole thing was consolidated and put on air. I eventually came to the conclusion, in retrospect, I think it was a rational conclusion, that he was so ignorant of the content of quote unquote his book, that it was clear he hadn't written it. And it was also clear that he hadn't even read it closely. So I did confront him with that third charge, and I said that I went on to say that subsequently, that every single substantive claim in the book, from the author's name on the cover to the last period in the book, was a lie. Now, Professor Dershowitz was very irked by what happened. It was, for him, a supremely humiliating experience. Because you have to understand how these interviews work. When you publish a book, your publisher, if you're a good publisher, I don't mean the ragtag publishers I have, but if you're a good publisher, part of the publicity material is they ask you, what questions would you like to be asked by your interviewer? And so you put down 4 or 5 questions. So when you normally get interviewed for a book, the interviewer is simply asking you what you told them to ask. So they're always very prepared, on top of the game, because they figure they're going to be asked these softball questions, which they have already had vetted by the interviewer. So he wasn't prepared for what I did, which is to say, as I said, I read his book twice. I was as I always do, I would never appear on the show with an author if I hadn't read the book at least twice. That's my personal standard. Well, then Professor Dershowitz went around saying that, quote, Amy Goodman and I had ambushed him. Ambushed him. And I replied, well, there is a certain truth to that. was it fair that of the two of us, only one of us had read his book?
You're on fire today.
Well, as you can imagine, he didn't take kindly to that. And then he went on well, there were two steps. The first step was I leveled a very serious allegations on the program. And obviously, in the course of a program, there's a very limited opportunity to document allegations of that magnitude. I felt I had an obligation to document them. Otherwise, I could be accused of being frivolous and glib. And so I then sat down. I proceeded to write a rather large book. I just pulled off my shelf. I wrote a rather large book called Beyond Chutzpah, which the first shorter part dealt with all these claims about a new anti-Semitism. But the large part of the book, very substantial part of the book, went through documenting exactly what I said in the debate with him. Not one substantive claim in the book was true, and number two, there was extensive plagiarism. Well, Professor Dershowitz was not happy with that project. It was also supposed to be published by University of California Press, like my book on Gaza. So he was particularly not happy with the appendix because the appendix documented the plagiarism. And as you know, in academia, the ultimate sin in academia is plagiarism. It's the equivalent in international law to genocide or in domestic law to pedophilia. To commit plagiarism is the ultimate crime. Well, he was not pleased with the book, in particular the plagiarism allegations in the appendix to the book. And so then he proceeded to try to suppress it. So you will recall perhaps, no, you won't recall because it just happened. Alan Dershowitz went on a program, Newsmax is it called?
Yeah.
Yesterday, in which he attacked President Claudine Gay on the grounds that she was not willing to release her research material pertaining to her book, so allegations against her could be cross-checked. And he said this is a gross violation, a gross breach of scholarly etiquette. If your research findings have been challenged, you have to release them. Well, what happened? What happened? Firstly, Professor Dershowitz went to the governor of California. Why the governor? Because the book came out from a university press. And if it's a university press, the Board of Regents for California is the oversight. And the governor is a member of the Board of Regents. So the governor at the time was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Alan Dershowitz went to Arnold Schwarzenegger and asked him to prevent publication of the book. Schwarzenegger said, no, that's a violation of academic freedom. I'm not going to do it. Whether he knew what academic freedom was or just his lawyers told him that, be that as it may, Dershowitz lost that round. He then boasted to the Boston Globe. He said to the Boston Globe, if you publish that book, I'm going to own your press. Wow. Which is true. You know, this was not an extravagant claim by him because university presses have a very modest budget. And Professor Dershowitz could drag you through court for years.
Right.
You know what your court fees are?
No.
He can do it in his own time, but they have to hire lawyers.
Right.
The press told me, look, Norm, you have to understand our problem. The head of the press said to me at the time, if he sues us in New York, we don't even have the money to fly in our editorial team.
Wow.
So he was not being brash when he said, I will own your press, I'll bankrupt you.
Yeah.
Well, that caused a crisis with the press, about which I'm not going to go into further now. And then what he did was he had one of those white shoe law firms, and they sent a letter to University of California Press, and I'll give you the exact wording. It was a very long correspondence, but there was one line that sort of just lifted off the page. I'm quoting you now word for word. He said, if you don't remove the appendix now, it's going to be a very painful operation later. It was like out of a mafia film.
Yeah.
We're going to take out the lead pipe. We're going to take out the lead pipes and break your kneecaps. So when you look at that history, and then you hear him attacking Claudine Gay for A, plagiarism, and B, for her refusal to hand over her her manuscripts and her research material. It's breathtaking. I did make the claim. I said to you, I'm not going to revise history. I said I didn't think he wrote the book. Well, he got, of course, very hot under the collar about that. He said, I have my handwritten draft writing that book. I said, okay, that's an interesting data point.
Right.
Would you mind letting me see that? He didn't let me see it. I requested it. And now he has the, my late mother used to say, it's no accident that Jews invented the word chutzpah, nerve. He has a chutzpah to attack Claudine Gay. It's a real sight to behold.